Hello, my name is Guy and you're watching How to Be a Great Player. Well, in today's episode, we are continuing our class breakdown and we are looking at the monk. Now, I said this in the teasers which go out on Facebook every week. I'm not a huge fan of the monk. As a matter of fact, when they introduced the monk class, I was very dubious of its role within Dungeons & Dragons, or within any fantasy setting for that matter. And the more and more I played with the monk, the more and more I really didn't like them. So making this video for me was a journey of exploration and understanding and trying to see just what is it that draws people to this character class, because I myself found it abhorrent. So if we look at the merits of the monk, what is a monk, quintessentially? What is the monk? So the monk is fairly good in hand-to-hand combat. The monk is able to snatch arrows out of the air as they're being fired towards them. So the monk is a good combat class. The monk is agile. They can move around. They have high dexterity. They don't wear armor, so they can move and get in and out of the way. So that's visually very cool, isn't it? They are mystical. When I think of monks, I think of Jackie Chan. I think of the Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon kind of ninjas moving around in the background unseen. That's why you didn't see them in the movie. I think of ninjas as well, to a certain degree. You think of the mystical monks in the Tibetan Himalayas, where they are all serene and calm until there's something that needs to be done, and then there's a whirlwind of furious fists and feet and head butting and all sorts of things, and the opponents lie absolutely massacred, and there is the monk back being nice and serene in their original lotus position. So there is a mysticism about the monk that gives it some very interesting options later on when we're looking at stories and at potentials. So there's that mysticism to the monk. And then, of course, the monk is always armed, unless, of course, their arms are chopped off, in which case then they're not. But that's an extreme case and unlikely to happen in most gaming environments. So the monk is always an armed character. Like a cleric who always has spells, the monk is always armed. And, of course, that is a major advantage. Now, some of the negatives around the monk class, in my opinion anyway, is that they are stereotypical. Yes, the paladins are seen as always being goody two-shoes, but the monks are always seen as waxing on and waxing off. They're always this mystical entity that floats around in loose flowing robes, has a mandarin moustache, and spouts out words of wisdom whilst being highly athletic and agile. Unfortunately, that is simply the image that permeates, at least in my opinion. Unless you're thinking of a Gregorian monk, in which case they wander around with a large book full of vellum pages, a quill ink, and they sing songs at mass and at breakfast and at dinner time and whilst they're having lunch and, writing books. So they're just singing all the time, all that kind of stuff. So monks really have a very, very strong stereotype, a very strong visual image that sits with them. And to break that, I think, is quite a challenge. They are limited to a large degree in what they can and can't do. A monk, yes, they don't get hit very often, they have a very good armor class, but they don't necessarily have the absorption power of a warrior, they don't have the healing powers of a cleric, and at lower levels they don't necessarily have the magical abilities of a spellcaster. So they are a in-between kind of class, neither here nor there, neither good nor bad, neither strong nor weak, just depending on the situation. So there is that. They also have limited items. Monks generally are unarmed in combat, or maybe they have one or two weapons, but they don't wear heavy armor, they don't wield shields, they don't wield swords or daggers or maces or clubs or axes. They don't have that repertoire necessarily of magical items that are available to them. So they are limited in terms of that, if that's something that's important to you. Now, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So that is essentially what I can see as the negatives of the class. Most classes don't have that many negatives, and this monks certainly don't either. It's just about how well the GM plays with them and how well you portray them that will change these negatives. Now, when we look at the potentials of the monk has the capacity to really fit into that little space where the rogue sometimes sits, which is someone who's agile, who can move about quite well, has very good dexterity skills, and someone who can be fairly stealthy because they're not wearing armor, and who can slip in and out of things and has the capacity to protect themselves should they get into trouble. So the monk has all of those infiltration missions that could potentially come with the class. The monk, and this was something that I realized as I was going through this, the monk has, I think, some of the greatest character growth potential of all the classes. And the reason for it is because they're not the greatest combatant, they're not the greatest tank, they're not the greatest healer, they're not the greatest spellcaster. But they, generally speaking, have, as part of that stereotype which was so negative for them, they have that learning novice. Now you have experienced a little bit of life. Now maybe you are an acolyte. Now you have experienced 40 years of life. Now maybe you are a student. Until finally one day you are considered to be a monk. And only when you are 190 will you become a master. So there is that non-game mechanic of character progression which is built into this class, and I really, really like that. So it allows you as the player to truly explore your character growing over time in power, in ability, but primarily in that social standing amongst fellow monks. You are attaining new levels of enlightenment, new levels of wisdom, new levels of understanding. And that for me is a great potential. It's a character potential. It's a lovely, lovely thing that you can play on. But again, the monk, I think, unlike other classes, the monk requires you as the player to really focus on those aspects, because its technical, mechanical aspects are fairly mundane, in my opinion. So it's the character development. That's very important. It also forces the character to have interpersonal development. Now, this is another thing where, when you look at films like Shaolin Monk and those of its ilk, the monk is usually seen as someone who is aloof and doesn't necessarily involve themselves in their other players' lives. Well, yes and no. If you look at, say, Splinter from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, I would say he's more of a monk than he is a samurai, or at least he's a samurai who's dual-classed into monk, because he has that mysticism about him, that training element about him. He generally fights unarmed. Well, he does have a tail, so I don't know if that counts. But he is this font of wisdom, but he has a strong bond with all of the turtles. He really, really cares for them and looks into each of them to help develop them and to give them sense of understanding. All of the masters of their monkish ways try and enable novices to develop, to learn, to appreciate. This isn't necessarily reflected in any other class where there is this passing down of knowledge from one to the other. So I would posit that the monk has the potential for this interpersonal relationship to develop with the rest of the party that other classes don't necessarily have, because they're busy worrying about spell choices, sharpening their weaponry, putting on armor, and all that kind of stuff. The monk doesn't have anything to do with it. Set up camp. I find a comfortable rock to sit upon and contemplate the universe. I'm done setting up camp. Really, no, seriously, I'm done, guys. It's a smooth rock. I can sleep on that. That's fine. I'm good. I don't need a tent. I don't need a fire. I don't need food. I don't need water. I'm good. I'm good. I'm going to go and contemplate. Or build into those character relationships. So that's an important potential for the monk. Now, if we look at the different types of monk that are available, this is where I really struggled to step outside of the stereotype box. And I think you might be able to help me in writing in comments below different types of monks that you have encountered. But these are the ones that I have become aware of through my various years of role-playing. The first one is the peaceful monk. The monk who doesn't break any sweat during a combat, who deflects, who knocks, who unconsciouses, makes unconscious, renders unconscious his opponents, who deflects arrows with grace and with calm, and who simply moves through a battlefield as a center of peace, with everything else falling around him, not dying, but being knocked unconscious or rendered useless for the purposes of battle. So that's the peaceful monk. You then get the weapon monk, the one who uses the wavy swords and the spears and you can tell I don't know necessarily the right terms for these weaponry, but it's that kind of flashy, showy monk, still not wearing lots of armor, but using rope chains, using all kinds of different weaponry that are slightly different, the exotic weapons in that listing of exotic weaponry in the most rulebooks. So that's the weapon style of monk who really does cool stuff with their weapons. Now, it's up to you as the player to describe those kind of things rather than I roll, oh yeah, I hit him, 8 damage. I coil out the chain directly towards his face, but at the last moment, pull it back, and whilst it's being pulled back, I jump up onto the chain, run forward, jump off the end, and bring the whole thing down as a hoop and headbutt him for 12 damage. That's the better way to do it, is to describe it. You then get the ninja monk, the one who is never seen, who slips in and out of shadows, and who doesn't appear to talk much. This is the still waters run deep character. This is the character who should have strong interpersonal skills, who should have a strong character backstory that is really emotionally good and invest in the other players because they're busy being stealthy, which almost necessitates them being an isolationist character. Be careful about that, but that they've got this amazing story that they can share with the rest of the players that'll really invest the players and their characters into your character. So the ninja monk, I think, is a very interesting one to play, but a very fine line between being a loner type character and being part of the party. You then get the Drunken Master, who teeters around drunk on wine or beer or however that might be. Jackie Chan is famous for being this kind of drunken master, and that's great. That's a very, very typical kind of class, a monk class to play. They can be really fun to play. They can bring a light mood to the entire thing while still being effective in combat. So there is a humorous style of monk rather than the serious style, and I think that's a good thing to explore, especially if the rest of your party are all very serious. The Drunken Master can become a very good type of monk to play. And then of course you get the mixed monk who kind of does a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of the next thing. Those are the more generic type of monks that almost everybody creates, and those are the ones that I'm not very keen on because they are generic. Choose a specific path, focus on that, or create a strong character. Not a generic, monk raised in the temple since he was 5, had bricks tied to his testicles and withstands all of that. I forget which movie that was from, but I think it was a Rowan Atkinson film. Anyway, doesn't matter. The point of it is, monks have the capacity to have these great backstories, and I think that's something that players should really look at. Now, if we look at the type of stories that can unfold with a monk, you've got the teacher-student story. That's the first one that must jump up and say, me, do this. Whether that's part of your backstory and then the GM uses your teacher coming in and out as they need help, as they request, as they get abducted, as all that kind of stuff, you must respond appropriately. If your teacher is in trouble, the bond between teacher and student, for a monk anyway, is very, very strong, or should be. And that will allow you to go on those kind of adventures. Self-discovery, the monk overcoming internal difficulties to find that moment of enlightenment. That's an amazing story arc that needs to be explored. That's a long-term journey, and that's something that you and your GM will have to work out and say, well, I really want my character to go from being this fairly obnoxious, pig-headed kind of character. I want them to push and become an enlightened character. And I'd like these few moments at some time in the adventures. And of course then the whole idea of trying to help their fellow party members to achieve inner enlightenment, that becomes a ongoing journey, and it's one that you don't have to include your GM in. That's one of the types of adventures that I particularly like when players do that, is when they have their own stories going on, and that's the player of the monk trying to convince the other characters to act in a different way, and to see how those characters over time start to follow the suggestion of the monk. So that's something that's really exciting about the monk class, is that there is that element of the intra-party play causing change and having adventures outside of the GM, because I think that's something that's absolutely wonderful. So those are my thoughts on the monk. I maybe am not so reluctant anymore to look at the monk class as a player. As a GM, I still have issues with an unarmed man being able to hit with the palm of his hand a dragon and cause damage. I need metal, steel, or magic. And yes, the key power of the monk often has been called a type of magic which could surround the monk's hand and create an energy that can cause damage. And I can live with that, as long as my players explain it to me very slowly and carefully and use small words like marmalade. Until next time, though, I wish you and yours the very happiest of playing.